Once again, welcome everyone to our first lecture for this year for the SWAS World Philosophies Lecture Series, the 12th in the series. The SWAS World Philosophies Lecture is now part of the broader seminar series organized by the Center for Global and Comparative Philosophies. So if you would like to get updates on forthcoming events, lectures, workshops, conferences, the email you got with the Zoom link, you'll find a link where you can join the mailing list for CGCP. Today, we're very, very pleased to have Professor Olúfẹ Táíwò with us. And just a quick clarification, Femi corrected me recently because there are two Olúfẹ Táíwò. So we have before us Olúfẹ Táíwò with the initials O, and then we have, he is in Georgetown University, and then we have Olúfẹ Táíwò without the initials O in Cornell University. Why it's a bit more difficult to distinguish them is because their areas of research often intersect. We know we are their fans here because they are very radical thinkers. And so it's hard to separate their works, but they are two separate people, obviously having this, coming from the Yoruba descent, but working on similar areas, two very different people. So we are very pleased to have Olúfẹ Táíwò with us. Last year, he was very busy publishing two excellent books. Reconsidering Reparation is one of them, which was published in Oxford University Press in the Philosophy of Race series, which is edited by Linda Martin Arkoff, who will be giving the March lecture for this lecture series, and also edited by Chike Jeffers, another very strong Afrikaner philosopher. And he is also the author of Elite Capture, how the powerful took over identity politics and everything else. So obviously from those titles alone, you can see that his works does have this very fine intersection of Afrikaner philosophy, social political philosophy, questions of justice, post-colonial studies, and so on. And so we are really eager to hear you talk today. And without further ado, I will invite you to share your slide and begin your lecture. After the lecture, after your lecture, my dear colleague, Dr. Sean Hawthorne, who is subject head for World Philosophies here, will moderate the question and comment session.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here. Thanks, Elvis, Sean, Andrew, for putting this together. I'm really glad to get to talk about this topic that I'm working on, which is, I think everybody has, who works on philosophy, who works on theory, has their kind of favorite problem, the thing that got them into philosophy, maybe, or maybe the question or topic that became nearest and dearest to their hearts as they studied. For me, that is the topic of freedom. I've been trying to figure out what I think about freedom. It's one of the oldest questions. And so I've gotten a chance to return to it recently, and what I'm presenting today on subjective security is one of the aspects of the things that I think about freedom. So I'm hoping we can all have a good chat about that today. In particular, the aspect of freedom that I want to talk about, the aspect of freedom that I think this strange term subjective security describes, is this possibility. I think it might be true that there's a sense in which a person needs to feel secure to actually be free, as I suppose you could say, an objective matter. And so the way that I'm trying out an exploration of this possibility is to try to say what contribution subjective security or the feeling of being free would have to the actual state of being free. So what contribution does subjective security make to this? So I won't give you the full version of what I think about freedom in the kind of political and ethical sense, but I will give you a bit of it just so it's on the table, so we can talk about it and so we can see the kind of broader view that I'm trying to develop by way of developing this narrower view on subjective security. I understand freedom in this ecological sense. Freedom has something to do with the sort of socially built environment. And you'll recognize the move there from, the tradition of thinking about so-called social construction, right? To the way that categories that we inhabit, identities that we inhabit, even territories that we inhabit, thinking about borders between countries and the countries themselves are things that are built through the accumulated weight of history and the past weight of human decisions. And that's certainly an aspect of the sense in which I think freedom is ecological, the sense in which I think freedom has to do with our built environments. We build concepts, we build institutions and ways of relating to each other that carry some weight and have something to do with how people are able to live, whether it's our conceptions of gender, whether it's the countries that we live in, whether it's the religious practices and rights that people have at their exposure to accept or deny or be part of. But I think in the era of climate crisis, of mounting ecological disaster, it's worth also meaning this term ecology to refer not only to the built environment, but to the environment, full stop. Right? There are aspects of the carbon cycle and of biodiversity, which it turns out are going to have quite a lot to do, and always have had a lot to do with what people could experience, with what was possible, and with the way that people were able to determine the course of their own lives, which is going to be near and dear to how I think about this idea of freedom. So some kind of environment encompassing the socially built aspects of our environment and perhaps the naturally built aspects of our environment, freedom is going to have something to do with a broad understanding of how those things are arranged. And all I want to say at this point is just to notice that for the whichever philosophers may be in the room, I'm hoping there's few, that there's the kind of abstract meta-ethical problem of rights as you might find it in Kantian or post-Kantian philosophy, and the problem of political independence as you certainly find in political philosophy, but as you also find out there in the political world, in the history of nationalist movements, so on and so forth. And this way of thinking about freedom, I think, runs those problems together in an important way. That's a thought I'll return to in just a moment, but I'm just going to flash the sign, these commitments on the screen in case anyone cares about them. These are broad things I think about freedom and about the world. The important one for today is, of course, the one that is in red. The idea that we need to feel secure to be free means that how we think about the world or how we subjectively experience the world, perhaps in a less cognitive sense or less propositional sense, but something about how it is that we relate to the world, what it is that we do in our personal lives has to do with our achievement of freedom. And the traditions that I come from, Black radical traditions, Marxist traditions, anti-colonial traditions, are more associated with a focus on the social structural conditions of possibility for freedom, the way society has to be set up, the way the means of production have to be shared between people. Those are the thoughts that are more readily associated with these kinds of political intellectual traditions. And so I'm trying in this talk to think about what might not be emphasized, but nevertheless be necessary or a part of the achievement of freedom at the personal and the collective level. So I want to say just a bit about some of the abstract metaethical stuff, and I will come down from this level of abstraction soon, but I think this is, or hope this is helpful setup. So, coexistence needs explaining. This is a quote from a paper by A.J. Julius on independent people. And it is an attempt to say what each of our possessions of agency have to do with everyone else's. Each person's ability to, in some sense, self-govern. What does that have to do with other people's ability to do so? Some people have views of agency, which are tightly connected to views of freedom, which view agency as a capacity that we have, or maybe as a kind of creature that we are. So we are agents categorically because we have the agential capacities that are built into perhaps our species, or built into the conception of being a rational agent. But to exercise agency, to live agentially, we run into the arrangement problem. And arrangement is a contingent matter, the way that history has gone. There's a lot of traditions that think something like this. I'm not going to run through them here, but they're on the slide if you care. At least one question of arrangement, how things are set up politically and socially speaking, for any one person has to do, of course, with what other people are doing. So in a kind of post-Kantian sense, this is a way of thinking about the problem of arrangement, the problem of other people, you could say, as being the problem of right. So what are the possible external incompatibilities between the possible actions of embodied persons? Both of us could decide to sit in the chair, but if there's just one chair and you're sitting there, then that is a contingent impediment to me exercising this particular aspect of self-government, this particular goal that I have set for myself. So thinking about the potential incompatibilities between the possible actions of people, because we are not simply rational agents who are deciding things to do, but we are also embodied persons whose bodies take up space over time and who sometimes compete for scarce resources and sometimes do things that present obstacles for the things that other people decide to do. We might think of ethics and we might think of the arrangement problem much like we think of traffic. Maybe we need to make decisions about which side of the road that we're all going to drive on so that everybody can get to where they're going and not be impediments to other people doing the same. So this is how Julius considers the possibility of this, this desideratum, this thing that we might want out of how social life is arranged, independence. All the space that we might ever occupy as we act for our purposes and the external resources we might devote to them, maybe they should fall under a single law of traffic, as he puts it. Maybe they should all be arranged in a way that allows us to solve or at least mitigate this problem. And this is quite like the political valence of the term independence. Maybe everybody, maybe the state system is supposed to offer this kind of independence for would-be self-governing countries. So other people, in a sense, present a problem to freedom. This problem might be contingent, as in Julius's way of framing it. It might be simply the fact that you want to sit in the chair that I'm sitting in that makes me a problem for your freedom. So we might will things that are in principle compossible, but contingently incompatible. It might be that I could sit in the chair later and you can sit in the chair now, or vice versa. And the things that we will could be resolved if there were a law of traffic that tells us when each of us gets to sit. So that would be a contingent problem for your freedom and my freedom posed by our embodied situation. On the other hand, there might be a deeper kind of problem that you pose to my freedom. Maybe the thing you will isn't simply sitting in a chair, which I happen to be sitting in, but maybe the thing that you will is being the ruler of the chair and getting to decide who sits where. Maybe even more pointedly, the thing that you will is you getting to decide where I sit, and not even directly about the chair. Maybe what you will is the frustration of my ends, or less episodically, what you will is to dominate me or oppress me or exploit me or give me orders or be my boss or be my master. There are all sorts of reasons you might will something like this, but both this contingent problem and the kind of deeper problem are problems for the exercise of freedom. And if you're following along with the reading the meta-ethical problems into the political ones, you will recognize the problems distinctive to the actual historical phenomenon of slavery or the historical phenomenon of colonialism in this putatively hyper-abstract meta-ethical problem of wills and ends. So again, freedom is an arrangement problem, but that arrangement problem touches on pretty recognizable political phenomena like self-government and oppressive institutions, and not just these kind of laws of traffic ways of abstractly representing the arrangement problem. These are the same or at least related. So the last thing I will say about what I think about freedom is that I have the kind of view at the bottom here. There's lots of ways that we can think about freedom. They overlap fairly heavily. But the way of thinking about freedom that I am trying to meet, the thing that I'm trying to build by way of this idea of subjective security that I'm going to go on talking about, is that freedom is self-determination. So we are unfree when we cannot determine the course of our own lives. Determining the course of our own lives is what freedom would be. So let's climb down a few levels of abstraction and think about actual people's lives for just a moment. So on May 13th, 1958, the woman depicted on the left, Carolina Maria de Jesus, was living in the Canindé favela of Sao Paulo. It was an auspicious date. It was the 70th anniversary of the abolition of slavery in Brazil. And what she spent that day doing was sending her children to beg for food from various neighbors. She decided to describe that day as fighting the present day slavery of hunger. For another way of thinking about freedom, just to say a bit about some other conceptions, there's a famous talk that happened that same year by Isaiah Berlin, where he distinguished between positive and negative forms of liberty, which I just treat as interchangeably with freedom. Now, Carolina Maria de Jesus is not describing her day as a failure of self-mastery, if anything, which Berlin would have thought of as having to do with positive liberty. She's exerting self-control over her impulses to make the decisions she makes about what to do and what to ask of her children and execute that decision. And neither is it a problem of negative liberty in any obvious way. So it's not as though there was a person telling her to send her children off to go beg for food. And so the kind of ready-to-hand interpersonal accounts of coercion, like someone holding a gun to your head, are not obvious descriptions of the situation she was in that day. Instead, it was a failure of security, which is the topic of today. In this case, it was a failure of material security, as I would put it. The background facts, the cost of living in her terms, which she takes herself to be enslaved to, undermines her exercise of agential control as a free exercise of agential control. Right? So this is the difference that interpersonal coercion makes. This is the difference a person putting a gun to your head makes. But it's not an individual identifiable person putting a gun to her head, but rather the outcome of the environment on the field in which she exercises her agency, right? Which is the Canindé favela, a slum in the global South. So we want then a structural view of freedom, or I guess I should say, a structural view of freedom that would account for this sort of experience. And there's a candidate view out there, or at least there is a view that offers some building blocks for such a view of freedom. And that simply is the philosophical school of materialism, broadly construed. A basic starting materialist thought is that we are embodied creatures with biological imperatives and needs, and we are this before we are anything else. So it is starting with the embodied version of the arrangement problem, rather than maybe the wills and ends abstract version of the arrangement problem. What kind of embodied creatures are we? What kinds of specific things do we need to achieve, whatever our subjective wills might be, in order to meet our basic biological needs? Well, fundamental to us maintaining ourselves, and thus materialists think to the explanation of historical events, are those social relations that bear on economic production, which is the subset of human activity that deals with how we produce the things that we use to meet our basic needs today, as well as reproduction, which is the activity that we do to make sure that we can do this tomorrow and the day after. So, with the materialist thought in mind, the sense in which Carolina Maria de Jesus explains that she is unfree makes sense, because the action she has to take to meet her basic needs, the structure of production under which she tries to meet her basic needs, is one that she does not have self-determination on or in. And whether or not this fits Berlin's concept, it seems that there's something we can make of this thought. That is, of course, I'm claiming something that fits into the freedom as self-determination broad view of conceiving of, explaining the idea of freedom. My view within that is something I'm calling autobiography. Autobiographical freedom is within the self-determination family. It is thus a view that says we are free when we can determine the course of our own lives. And I have an ecological version of a freedom of self-determination view. So we need to collaboratively produce the material resources and the cultural resources for people to determine the course of their own lives. I'm certainly not the first to arrive at this view. I take it to be Cabral's view of freedom, which helpfully for the case that I was making earlier of the unity of the political and meta-ethical sense of freedom, at least conceived in this way. Cabral's account of national liberation or freedom on a national scale is just the right of people to have their own history, as he would put it, or perhaps story, as maybe I would put it. Imperialist domination usurps that by taking control over the process of development of the national productive forces. So taking control over the development of material resources turns out to be an impediment to freedom, even in this kind of deeper ethical sense. So I take this to just be Cabral's view, and I am at most elaborating it. I'm sure someone has had this view even before him, but I don't think so. So everything I've said so far has tended towards the kind of structural dimension, with the exception of the detour through Carolina Maria de Jesus's explanation of her day in May of 1958. Indeed, even the discussion of that day might pull in the other direction. The brief description of the day that I give makes it sound as though she couldn't possibly have achieved freedom, at least in the deep freedom and self-determination, autobiographical sense of freedom, because the conditions of possibility of her life in the favela were so restricted. And that is indeed what I think. The social structural conditions are conditions of possibility, so they deny freedom to large swaths of the population. In fact, I think everyone, categorically. And so it would be right to say that we need to change the social structural conditions, how we decide which people get income and housing and food. Those kinds of aspects of how our society produces and reproduces are things that we would need to change fundamentally to make this world compatible with the possibility of freedom for anyone. But if we shared the productive resources, if we revolutionized how housing was distributed, would that in and of itself be sufficient rather than necessary for the achievement of freedom for everyone who lives in such a social structure? I actually think the answer to this is no. And subjective security is part of my explanation of why. So what would I need to do as a person, or need to achieve, even in the world that has been fundamentally reconstructed, to be free? So subjective security is a kind of security. Security is something that we need, and security is not obviously either an aspect of or exhausted by economic production or social reproduction. In particular, security with respect to basic needs is an important building block of freedom. And here, I again think that there's a deep metaethical thing underneath the more recognizable political thing. It is very clear what secure housing means or secure access to food means. But there's also a deeper kind of metaethical commitment that I have here about action. So security, on my view, is the glue that holds the parts of processes together. Subjective security is just one kind of security. I think that's all we need is this slide. Why subjective security? Why does it not simply need to be true that someone will have reliable access to food over a period of time or reliable access to housing over a period of time? Why do people need to know and feel that? And the kind of thing that I'm thinking about is the kind of phenomenon that Michel Rolfe-Trouillot was talking about in his famous book, Silencing the Past. He quotes this French colonial slave owner in 1790, saying this peculiar thing. There's no movement among our Negroes, he said. They don't even think of it. They're very tranquil and obedient. And if you know your history and notice the date there, you know that Labar was world historically wrong about this. This is on the eve of the Haitian Revolution, the greatest uprising of enslaved people in human history. Security has to do with the fact that actions are extended. They're extended across time, they're extended across space, and they are extended across persons. Take the simple action of me cooking you a meal, which consists of smaller and individual actions. Me going to the grocery store to buy the food for the meal, perhaps, my chopping the vegetables, my turning on the oven. So some of the individual actions that are part of this larger action of me cooking you a meal are my actions. But some of them aren't my actions at all. Some of them are your actions. You leaving your house to come over and eat the meal. You're sitting down at the table and chewing the food that I've cooked for you. And some of the actions are neither. The bus driver driving the buses that get you from your place to mine, and so on and so forth. Each part of these processes, whether they're mine or yours or the bus drivers, they depend on the other parts, both for their justification and their basic constitution. So the fact that you're later chewing the vegetables that I chopped earlier both makes it good that I was chopping those vegetables earlier, but also makes it the case that I was chopping those vegetables earlier. What I'm driving at is that our putatively individual exercises of agency in a deep metaphysical sense rely on lots of things about the ecology, not simply for their justification, but actually for their basic constitution. What we are doing when we exercise agency is participating in processes that are larger than us in time and persons and space. It's because I am secure, perhaps, I am sure that you will come over later, or I at least feel sure that you will come over later. It is in virtue of the expectations or the things that I rely on about the world that I can represent myself as cooking you a meal when I am chopping vegetables hours earlier. It's in virtue of those expectations that I can represent myself as doing the whole action. And it's in virtue of those expectations that I do the smaller actions that make the larger action. Right? It's the grounds for my expectations are your willingness to come over, the public transportation that will come over, and my reliance in some sense, in some subjective sense, that all these things will happen. I may not be thinking about them. In fact, things go better if I'm not thinking about them. And I'm just thinking about chopping the vegetables. But in fact, I'm relying on all of these things. Labar was relying on all these things. right? There was a whole apparatus of social actions that were designed to produce the feeling of safety and reliance that Labar had on the social structure around him. We could say that Labar felt subjectively secure out of something entirely idiosyncratic or personal or psychological, maybe exceptional naivete or recklessness or inattention to the social political traditions around him. But I think we would be discounting a whole aspect of the colonial government of Saint-Domingue, as it was known then as the French colony, that was designed to produce this subjective state in him. Of course, we know a bit about what those are. In the US, we have a long conversation about the slave patrols, which are regional, which were developed in Saint-Domingue and the US South, and the Spanish colonies of the Caribbean, South America, and the British colonies of the Caribbean. There were all kinds of forms of labor discipline, which were used to objectively stop slave revolts, but also to reassure the people whose management made the plantations lucrative for the French colony, reassure them that that was a worthwhile and survivable endeavor. So that is the basic idea of what subjective security is, and what role it plays in some of the political phenomena that I'm interested in. Let's say a bit more about it as a psychological phenomenon, because as I've just discussed, it's not a purely psychological phenomenon, but it does have something to do with how we think about the world, what we choose to fear, what we choose to attend to. Those choices are not all ours, but they do have to do with our emotional and psychological setup. This has long been noticed by psychologists, although they've not always thought about it in the way that we presently think about things. In particular, the study of psychology and the changes in recent centuries, particularly in the 20th century, to how psychology is thought about, has, I think, some clues for what subjective security might be like and what might need to happen at the personal and interpersonal scales, which are much smaller, but causally related to the larger social structural scales for people to be free. There was a long 19th century and earlier conversation about what was then known as hysteria and taken to be a particular psychological affliction of women. And early psychologists like Charcot and later Genet and Freud looked into hysteria and what kinds of reasons there were for the psychological problems that women diagnosed with hysteria were exhibiting. And through exhaustive study, these figures, these psychologists, found something that they were not supposed to find, which was that there was endemic childhood abuse of a sexual nature to the women, many of the women that were exhibiting hysteria. And partly because they found this kind of scandalizing result, they backed away from the implications of their study, in particular Freud, who had been studying the French bourgeoisie and apparently did not want the political problems of implicating many of the men in this class of widespread abuse of children. However, the study of trauma once again became a major topic amongst prominent psychologists, or proto-psychologists, I guess you could say, during and in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. The psychological ramifications of mass death and the kind of advances in barbarity and the technology of mass killing that were on full display in the First World War also helped magnify the psychological casualties of serving on the front lines. Indeed, as many people as had battlefield physical injuries in the First World War had lasting psychological ramifications of serving on the front lines. Even for a while, they thought that the concussive effects of blasts might have harmed people's skulls, even if they weren't physically hit by the rounds. And so the initial diagnosis was what was called shell shock. But eventually they realized that a lot of the people afflicted by these psychological maladies weren't close enough to the exploding shells for there to be this kind of purely physical concussive explanation for their psychological symptoms. And so the term combat neurosis ended up being used. And then later on in the 20th century, there was a synthesis of two parallel but linked kind of political movements, especially amongst the US psychological community, which was attached to the anti-war movement on one hand, of combat veterans experiencing combat neurosis, and the women's liberation movement of women who were survivors of various kinds of intimate partner violence, experiencing psychological ramifications of that. And eventually psychologists realized that there weren't two separate gendered phenomena, one being linked to the old discussion of hysteria and the other being linked to the old discussion of shell shock or combat neurosis, but there was in fact simply one human psychological phenomena that was happening, which is what we now think of as trauma in the modern sense. I'm actually going to skip this and skip to talking about the absence of subjective security or subjective precarity, whatever you would like. When studying trauma victims, psychologists were finding that one load-bearing aspect, besides reliving the actual traumatic experience themselves, was an ongoing change to the way that people experienced the world. This is related to the meta-ethical concept of subjective security. You could call it subjective precarity or insecurity, whatever you'd like, but people affected by trauma were less willing, if not unwilling, to rely on the world in ways that they had before experiencing the trauma. Subjective precarity in general, thinking now about the kind of meta-ethical underlying concept, might well be put this way, as a reliance problem. In our toy example earlier, I relied on lots of things. I relied on the bus driver, and I relied on your attitudes and willingness to cooperate with me in order to cook you a meal. And in general, we rely on our predictions about the world, but we also rely on the cooperation of the world, which is something a bit different from simply being predictively reliable. You know, if I predict the interference of other people, that is another way that I can fail to rely on them. So I need to trust not only in the kinds of forecasts that I make about the world, about the bus driver, about you, but I also need to rely on whatever regularities there are or aren't in the world being somehow for me or harmonious with me, or things that I can join up with to act in the world. So even self-determination would have this deep social character to it, and this deeply socially collaborative character, as opposed to a sort of socially antagonistic character. I will skip to this. This is part of what I'm after in studying trauma and the kinds of injury to this aspect of our agential capacities that is most directly tied to the idea of subjective security and its absence. There's something that is up to us, or something that is relevant to our seemingly individual psychology, such that even in the best social structures, there is something that we would have to achieve at the level of our person, at the level of our psychology, in order to be free. The narcissist, the reckless risk seeker, the chronically negligent or inattentive, the person with delusions of grandeur, all experience forms of subjective security, right? Or at least the psychological analog of what we would like out of subjective security, right? They certainly don't think or don't pay attention to things going wrong with whatever plans they set with the world. But there's nevertheless perhaps something missing there. And similarly, this is what the lesson that I take from some of the trauma research. The scared person, the overthinker, the person with injured senses of self-efficacy also experiences forms of subjective security, or subjective precarity, or subjective insecurity. And in neither of these cases can we explain why the narcissist has an appropriate amount of subjective security, or the person with injured senses of self-efficacy has an inappropriate amount of subjective precarity, simply by recourse to these psychological states. So there's something that has to be achieved at the social structural level, and there's a kind of fit that there needs to be between what has or hasn't been achieved at the social structural level and the level and form of subjective precarity or subjective security. So the ideal of subjective security would be when there's the right kind of fit between the level of security someone feels or thinks themselves to have and the level of security that they in fact have. So the ideal subjective security and the ideal objective security would mutually constitute each other. Which is, again, simply to say that when I am licensed, when I am relying on the world because it is actually reliable, as opposed to because I ignore the reasons that it is not reliable, that's when I have achieved the ideal subjective security. And when the regularities that I rely on predictively are actually there to help me, as opposed to when I'm simply exploiting them, that would also be a good kind of reliance. And all of this is my story about how we would rely on the world in the free version of the world. So we would have a social structure that was predictive in the right kind of ways. I could expect to have food tomorrow. I could expect to have housing tomorrow. And I wouldn't be expecting to have food or housing tomorrow because I won a lottery. I would expect to have food or housing tomorrow because me having food and housing tomorrow is part of why our food system works in the way that it does. Because me having housing tomorrow is part of why our housing and constructive systems work in the way that they do. They are for me and all the other people to have housing and food, and to know that they will have housing and food, and to be able to rely on those things. So we would need a world where those things were true. We would need a world where people, in fact, had reliable access to their basic needs and weren't a few paychecks away from homelessness or cold or food insecurity. And we would need a world where we did all that on purpose, where we organized our productive capacities in order to produce those political outcomes. But we would also need a world where people internalized those regularities in the right kind of way. Actually organizing the production of food and housing would go a long distance towards making it possible and achievable for people to feel free and to feel the kind of security that is compatible with freedom on my account, but it would not do the job by itself. I'll skip to an illustrative example to try and get this off the ground. So what is it that's missing from the way that the world is currently set up that makes something unachievable about the best form of subjective security, the ideal form of subjective security that I'm driving at? And this is a story I told in the reparations book, partly with an eye towards this kind of view of freedom. There is an old way of making soy sauce that involves a particular kind of cedar and particular kind of barrel making skills. And some people still make soy sauce this way, Yasuo Yamamoto being one of the few who still does. In virtue of what can he exercise freedom in this particular way, doing the production of soy sauce? There's some things that he, in fact, in the world as is currently constructed, relies on. Some of those involve other people. His grandfather, generations ago, and a neighbor planted the cedar trees, which have decades-long lifespan and growth, and it is these trees that make this form of production possible. The wood from the trees participates in the process. The microorganisms and the soy mash participate in the process. The weather participates in the process and accelerates the chemical reactions that make the soy sauce what it is and give it its distinctive flavor. He relies on some other people in the present and not just in the past. Ueshiba and his team make the barrels using knowledge that's been passed down across generations. And so relying on these things, his ancestors, his current colleagues, the weather, the microorganisms, allows him to make soy sauce the old way, and he feels fairly secure in doing so. But nevertheless, on my way of thinking about this, he gets lucky. The world is not structured so as to provide him with the relevant affordances. The world is structured to make forests vulnerable to the capricious decisions of capitalists who use forests for surplus value, timber and whatnot. The environmental regulations that protect them, either directly in Japan by deciding who can log where, or indirectly in the world by deciding the rate of emissions that threatens wildfires across the world. Those are the things that have to come off in the right way so that he has access to the cedar, and they just happen to be oriented in a way that preserves the possibility of Yamamoto making soy sauce the old way. They are not managed to produce this outcome. He can rely on the contribution of Ueshiba and his team, not because those people necessarily simply believe in his cause, but also because the system of wage labor means that if they don't get a job like the one that they have, they will not be able to eat or shelter themselves. And so there is a coercive structure underneath the reliance that Yamamoto has on Ueshiba and his team. And so he may well feel psychologically very secure that he can continue to produce soy sauce in this way, but it's not because any of the things he relies on, or it's not because all the things he relies on are there for him to rely on them. They just happen to be organized in a way that's compatible with the particular goal that he has. So the kinds of reliance that he has on the world, the predictive reliance that the seeder will be there and the wage laborers will be there to help him make the soy sauce, is of a degraded kind. In particular, I draw your attention to this idea of constitutive reliance. The organization of the world is compatible with his reaching this goal, but they are not organized to make this goal within reach for him or anyone else. He just happens to occupy a social position that lets him exploit some regularities for ends that he happens to have. And presumably the wage laborers making the barrels that Yamamoto uses to produce soy sauce cannot rely on anything even resembling the kind of reliances that Yamamoto is able to rely on. This is simply to say that the built world, our built environment, the ecology in which we exercise our agency, is not structured to let us live full and meaningful lives and do meaningful things like producing soy sauce in ways that are keyed to the value of soy sauce. But our built world is instead built to respond to values that are either at odds with or simply orthogonal to whatever other goals we might have. Notably, of course, the reproduction of various hierarchies and perhaps above all, the accumulation of capital. If the world is like this, if that's an apt characterization of the world, then full lives built on constitutive reliance or the good kind of security, subjective and objective, are ruled out. What we need, if this is on to something, is another social context for our actions, one on which we can constitutively rely on the world, one on which the regularities in the world that make us safe actually succeed in making all of us safe and not just a few of us, and not by accident, but on purpose, because the model of freedom that I have, as I've been saying, is self-determination. So we try to make the world navigable by all of us and for each of us, and we succeed at doing that. So in what time remains to me, I don't want to take up too much time, but what is it that we can do before remaking the world? What kind of subjective security can we have before remaking the world? Structural views of freedom or anything else are views about how society is organized. And they describe the conditions of possibility for, I think, the fullest versions of freedom and equality and democracy and so on and so forth. But it doesn't follow from that because we can't have the full versions in the world as it currently sits, that there's no other meaningful choices between possibilities in the degraded world that we have in front of us. Sorry, I'm not sure why I lost the slides. Let me try and pull them back. Yeah. Okay. Hopefully you can all see this slide now. So I just want to end by saying some of the non-ideal lessons for subjective security. What is it that we can have before the whole world is made a great place? This is something, as you could guess, that psychologists who are studying trauma and trying to treat it were coming up with, or trying to think about at the very least. And they noticed that those veterans who had frozen and dissociated tended to have worse psychological outcomes later. And also the so-called Rambos, the people who had plunged into impulsive and isolated action and tried to take on the world themselves, had also had the worst outcomes. Similarly, for survivors of domestic and sexual violence, the people who resisted had the best outcomes. What they draw from this is that disempowerment, a loss of feeling of self-efficacy, and disconnection from others, a loss of reliance on other people, are core experiences of psychological trauma. Recovery is based on rebuilding that sense of self-efficacy and rebuilding the connections between people and others. And on my view, on the particular view of actions that I've developed, I think there might be a deep connection between, what we might think of as self-efficacy and connections to other people. What it is to exert action, what it is to act in a social ecology is simply to rely on the world around you, which includes other people in certain kinds of ways. And so building those willingnesses to rely on others is deeply, in my view, part of building self-efficacy. The last point I want to make is simply this. The basic materialist approach to history, to politics, starts with us as material embodied beings and explains everything else from there. And traditionally, that has meant thinking about the political problems of other people and relying on other people, as I just said. Often in abstraction from the rest of the natural world, a kind of focus on human society and human relationships. Accordingly, self-efficacy, self-government, whether at the individual or the collective stage, has often been framed around appropriating resources to compete amongst ourselves, our fellow humans, for status and control. But we should, in the era of climate and COVID-19 and ecological collapse, be humbled by the emphatic reassertion of nature's own causal powers. Much sooner than we think, we will be asking basic questions about how we're going to secure ourselves and our basic needs that we cannot ask or answer by reference to simply competitions between us and other human beings, but that will have to do with what the rain is up to and what the carbon cycle is up to and the level of biodiversity in our environments. This is, I think, if anything, a return to at least the original implications of materialist thought, which is simply that our relationship as embodied creatures with embodied material needs to the world around us is paramount. And our collective political answers to developments in the natural world are going to be the basis for winning the actual conditions of possibility for freedom for people at the political, social, structural level, and at the subjective level. So I will stop there. Thank you.
I think you're muted, Sean.
Sorry, I always do that. Thank you so much. That was an absolutely riveting and such an elegant account of your thinking towards freedom and its possibilities. And I think, you've given us a great deal to think about as a consequence. And I'm sure many of us are going to to have some questions. We've got about 20-ish minutes, but depending on how it all goes. So if you've got questions, you can either raise your hands or you could type your question in the chat if you're not feeling brave enough to speak. And I'll keep an eye on both. I think I would perhaps like to kick off with a question, then I'll come to you, Anna. And, you know, I was, of course, very struck throughout your talk in the kind of way that you kind of broken it down for us about what, you know, the kind of, I guess, conditions of necessity to arrive at subjective security. And I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about how that connects to your work in rethinking reparations, where you talk about distributive justice and the ways in which that's a sort of future-looking, future-building form of justice. So in some ways, what is the connection between justice and subjective security?
Yeah, thanks, Sean, for the question. So in the reparations book, I'm kind of trying to make the point that I made at the end of this one, right? So there's a view of reparations I'm critical of in that book, the relationship repair view of reparations that says, you know, primarily reparations projects should be about repairing the damage to relationships between groups, whether we think of that as, you know, the kind of spiritual reconciliation between groups that are associated with a harm and groups that are associated with doing the harm, or maybe even the kind of primarily psychological, spiritual, and emotional restoration of healthy psychology in an affected community. And all of those are, of course, you know, important goals. And I don't think that they are by any means irrelevant to what we should be trying to achieve by way of reparations or anything else. But what I'm trying to get people, what I'm trying to motivate is this broader ecological view, right? What I think is implausible is the idea that we can expect the causal result or the consequences of changing relationships to people, relationships between people, say between an oppressed group and an oppressor government, that we're going to go from that improved relationship to improved social results for the marginalized groups of people, right? What I'm really opposing there is the idea, you know, the kind of animist view of oppression, where what oppression comes to, what explains oppression, is the bad attitudes or bad regard that the ruling class has of particular marginalized people. And I just don't think that is actually, in fact, what explains the oppression of most groups of people, or probably, yeah, I think that's what I should say. I don't think that's what explains it. And even if I thought that was what explained it in the present, I certainly wouldn't think that that would be what would explain people's political conditions at 4 degrees Celsius, right? There are just other causal things that you have to pay attention to if what you're invested in is improving the life chances and opportunities of, you know, a group of people. You have to actually be holistic about what the obstacles are between them and flourishing. And I don't think that's a prioritization that makes much sense to me.
Thanks. That was a fantastic answer. Again, lots to think about there. Anna.
Hi, thank you so much for your inspiring talk. I really loved that you mentioned Carolina Maria de Jesus, who's actually one of my favorite authors. And I've got two questions which are not really linked to each other. So I'll start with one to pick up on what you finished your talk, and the interconnections between the individual and the collective or the community. And when we look at trauma studies especially, and Judith Herman mentions it, Laura Brown extends on it, is the need for the individual, the traumatized individual, to be recognized as a trauma victim, as someone who's been a victim of violence and who's traumatized, and that security or disengagement with the world can only start when there is a recognition of the right to trauma. And I was wondering whether that played any role in your theories, in your thought. And the other one is related to something, well, perhaps somewhat related, the feeling of fear, because when we feel insecure, when we are in insecure positions, we also have the feeling of fear, and that can also be socially constructed, as Pumla Dineo-Kola mentions in Female Fear Factory, how women are conditioned to be afraid of their environment and how that impedes our free movement in the world, and whether that is the feeling of fear is anything relevant to your thought.
Yeah, thanks a lot for both. And I think both are highly relevant to my thought. Maybe I'll start with the second one, right? I'm really influenced by that kind of account of oppression. I think it's obviously different in a lot of ways, but there is some overlap with what slave patrols and policing and strike breaking were meant to achieve, right? The idea that you can harm someone's self-efficacy directly, not necessarily by always changing the objective conditions of whether or not there are scary things out there, but by making the scary things more salient, by conditioning people to be afraid. That is a way to, further cement their domination and injure their self-efficacy. And, lots of military strategies are explicit about this particular goal, whether it's shock and awe or rapid dominance theory, as US military strategists talked about, or, how, the strategy of terrorism is also explicitly designed around this goal, right? So I think we need to think seriously about what fear is an attempt to achieve politically. And I think on the question about the interconnection between individual and community and the recognition of someone as someone who has been traumatized, as someone who has gone through trauma, that reason, that kind of relationship between individual self-conception and their getting recognition from the community in a certain way is part of the reason why the particular thing that I say is necessary for my view of freedom is material resources and cultural resources, right? So the way that I'm thinking about it is, we could describe the behavior of someone being recognized as a trauma victim and someone recognizing themselves as a trauma victim and accepting that and working through what they need to deal with this kind of psychological injury. But I think the ecological question of whether or not that's going to happen has to do with broader cultural resources. How do people speak about trauma in general, right? What are the norms about how we respond to trauma when we find it around us? Those are cultural aspects. Those are aspects of what norms predominate, and they're a part of the kind of built architecture of behavior in the social cultural sense that I want. So I think the point that you're driving at there is a really important one, at least to this aspect of my view.
Thanks, Andrew.
Hi, thanks so much, Professor Táíwò. I've really enjoyed your talk, and I'm also really fascinated in trying to find that soy sauce now that you were talking about. But my question was, so basically, I was really swayed by the concept of autobiographical freedom and subjective security. It makes intuitive sense. One question I had was trying to maybe understand more what location you feel like this takes place on. So let me see what I mean. But I'm trying to like tease out my own assumptions here and understand more where you're coming from. So I'm like trained in post-Kantian European philosophy, and I immediately am thinking about life worlds and pre-theoretical versus theoretical. And I was thinking about the example you used of Labar feeling secure because of this apparatus, or a trauma victim, the things that they experience creating trauma, on the one hand, are very pre-theoretical. On the other hand, they begin to articulate and talk about feeling secure or not feeling secure, and to write their own biography, as you pointed out. So I was just curious about if you feel that security has subjective security has a location in that way, or if there's something fundamentally that I'm missing where you're coming from with that, because I really liked the concept, and I was just thinking, what location precisely might you think that subjective security takes place on? Thank you.
So I think, and let me know if I'm not getting at your question, but in terms of location, I think that subjective security is essentially a sort of three-place relation. So there's a psychological aspect of it residing in a person. There's a kind of collective psychological aspect of it residing in the community of people that engage with that person. And then there is the kind of objective facts of, or the objective context in which both of those psychologies are embedded, right? And so, you could have the kind of, if you're looking at the individual as a node of that network, you could have something that looks like what that node would look like, but in the wrong kind of relation to the other parts, right? So that's what I'm getting at when I say, the narcissist or the reckless person has what looks like subjective security, but if you look at the actual objective features of their context, you can't make sense of that confidence as being a kind of rational response to the actual danger-making features of that context. And I think what Anna was driving at was, kind of the community aspect of that relation, right? So you could have someone feel injured self-efficacy and fail to get the right kind of psychological response from their community because they don't have the right norms about how to think about trauma. And that problem is extended across that relation. So I have this three-place kind of thing in mind, which is what I'm driving at when I describe this view as ecological.
That's super useful. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Zona, sorry if I've not pronounced that correctly.
No, that's correct. Thank you. Was very happy to be a part of this. Thank you very much. I wanted to tell you that here in Paris, where I teach political philosophy at the American University of Paris, you are as I've muted myself. I wanted to tell you that I think with my students, you have the status of a rock star. And this is really more than a question. I would like to use this opportunity to invite you to be a visiting speaker, if you would like that, in either political philosophy or contemporary political thought. We have a week where the students read both books. And so I would have a ton of questions, mine and theirs, but I'm aware of the time frame. And so I would formally want to extend the invitation if Paris is anyway in your plans for travels. And thank you.
Yeah, shoot me an email. I'll have to talk with my wife. But thank you. That's really nice to hear.
Who could say no to Paris? Any other questions? Rich, sorry.
Thanks for a really, really excellent talk. Really well presented, and I really like that opens up the idea of subjective security. I wanted to ask you about linking this to your work on your book Elite Capture. I wanted to ask you about those forces, those groups within society that, unlike me, would not necessarily be on board with the project that you're talking about. You talked about the kind of narcissists in a general sense, and at an individual level, we can talk about cognitive dissonance as a kind of la attitude, which ignores subjective precarity or even social precarity more generally. But what we're clearly seeing in the political sphere, particularly on the right, on the far right, you might say, is the cultivation and projection of ideologies that actively obfuscate certain precarities, or at least try to make claims about a future security for a certain group of people, which is often seen as being in opposition to, in a kind of zero-sum game with other groups in society who are seen as, if they have more freedom, then we have less. And I wonder if you could say anything about that side of things, basically.
Yeah. Thanks. That's you know, on the intellectual side, that's a problem, and it's a core problem, but I think there's a handful of core problems with trying to elaborate this view. But on the political side of things, I kind of think this is the problem. You know, or at least, you know, it seems plausible to me that's towards the top of, you know, why we can't have nice things in the world as it's currently formed, right? And it's something that in other parts of the view I'm trying to talk about by making the distinction in how security is produced, right? So how is it that we come to be subjectively secure, or how is it that we come to be objectively secure, right? And what you described is what I call antagonistic security. And it's how I describe the slave patrols. It's the story I tell about Labar. You know, one way to make myself feel safe is by, you know, making things actually dangerous for the people who I think would harm me or interfere with me, or at least convincing myself that I have done that, right? So I have, you know, it's the safety that you feel behind a barbed wire fence, essentially. And I think this is also what, you know, this is also what Cabral was driving at, right? This, in a lot of ways, like if you wanted a deep kind of basic description of what colonizers try to achieve, I think this would be one description of it. And honestly, I wish I had a kind of clever response, but I think this politics just has to lose, right? I think this politics has to be defeated. And I think it's a question of contest. Like, I don't think it's a question of persuasion. Like, there have to be the kinds of political conflicts about which of those ways of thinking about producing security are going to be the way that we're going to do it, right? Are we going to, you know, close borders and make fortresses, or are we going to distribute vaccines in an egalitarian way, right? I think, as a matter of fact, if we were to argue about it, the second strategy should win more often than not, because it actually just is measurably better of an approach to producing security for everyone. But more importantly, I think it just is the way of producing security that is compatible with anyone being free. And I don't think the colonizers even succeed in making themselves free by securing themselves in the way that they try to. Maybe you don't need to be free if you're rich. You know, maybe Jeff Bezos isn't worried about whether he's free or not, which, you know, that's between him and his therapist. But I think for the rest of us, we have a lot to gain if the people who want barbed wire fence versions of freedom, either for themselves as individuals or for, you know, an artificially small section of the human population, I think most of us have something to gain if that politics loses.
Thank you.
Well, we have time for one more quick question if someone's got one. I'm not going to ask the question that would have all of my colleagues' eyes rolling to sort of talk through the relationship that there may or obviously is not to Afro-pessimist kind of ideas of coalitional politics. Go for it, Andrew. Save everyone.
If you want.
No, that sounds like a much more interesting question, and please answer that if you want. I was just wondering, very simply, do you think democracy can achieve subjective security?
I think it can, but I think the most we can say of democracy is that it's the only form of decision-making that I think would be compatible with ideal subjective security. And this is one of the things that's implicit in my target, where I'm saying, social structural change would be necessary for subjective security in the ideal sense, but not sufficient, right? And that's why there's a remainder to be achieved at lower levels of scale. Even thinking at the social structural levels of scale, we could simply fail to make the democratic decisions that in fact secure our food systems. We could fail democratically to make the democratic decisions that in fact secure housing for everyone, right? And this is another challenge, that I'm trying to make to the kind of anthropocentrism, to the kind of, view of political struggle between human beings as totally decisive in these questions about whether or not people are free and whether or not we have an ideal political system. Like, you actually, some of the competitions that are between us and unfreedom are human beings versus the boll weevil, right? Some of the competitions are human beings versus the hurricanes. And, even beating the capitalists isn't going to necessarily beat the hurricanes. And, these are things that we need democratic structures to, that I think we need democratic structures to achieve, but I think we also need democratic structures to get something right in order to allow us to experience freedom of the kind that I'm interested in.
I think that's a perfect ending to what's been a really, really fantastic session. Thank you so much for your generosity in coming and speaking to us today. You are a rock star, and you're just going to have to get used to it. Thank you all also for coming. Those of you who don't know, sorry, I'm just going to open the chat here. We have a Facebook group where all of the seminar sessions are announced and links provided, and you're always very welcome to come and work with us on our, I guess, peculiar but we think very exciting project, which is to globalize and decolonize philosophy. And I think we've had a fantastic talk today that's really shown us perhaps some of the stakes in that kind of thinking. So thank you again, Professor Táíwò. It's been absolutely brilliant to meet you and listen to you. And thank you all also for coming. Bye.
Thanks a lot, everybody,
Thank you.
for having me.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.